The sun was a hammer, and the sky was an anvil. Hannah felt each beat of it on the crown of her head, through the thin veil that was now little more than a dusty rag clinging to her hair. White. She had wanted everything to be white, a clean start, a pure promise. Now, the dress was the color of bone dust and old sorrows, its fine lace hem shredded by sagebrush and rock. The tiny seed pearls, stitched by her own hopeful hands, were gone. Lost to the unforgiving earth she had been walking over for 2 days. Or was it 3? Time had become a blur of heat and thirst, a singular, agonizing present. Her feet were bare. The delicate satin slippers, meant only for a walk from the church door to a carriage, had surrendered within the first few miles. Now the soles of her feet were a map of her journey, blistered and cut and burned by the baked ground. She did not feel the pain anymore, not in a sharp way. It had become a dull, constant rhythm, a companion to the ache in her chest. James. His name was a stone in her throat. She remembered the sound of the shot, how it had cracked the clean morning air, so loud and final. It had silenced the birds. It had silenced her heart. She remembered the sight of him, falling beside the water trough where he had stopped to speak to a man she did not know. The red on his white wedding shirt had spread like a terrible bloom. A debt, they said later. A gambling debt. He had wagered their future and lost. He had wagered her and lost. After the single shot, there was only the screaming. Not hers. She had made no sound. It was his mother who had screamed, a raw, animal noise that had torn through the stunned silence of the town square. Then came the whispers, sharp and cruel as scattered glass. They looked at her, standing there in her white dress like a ghost at the wrong funeral. They saw not a grieving bride, but a curse. The woman who had brought ruin. Her own kin had been the first to turn away. Her aunt, her mother's sister, had met her at the door of the small house where she had been raised, her face a mask of hard piety. "It is not right for you to be here," she had said, her voice thin and brittle. "A woman left at the altar carries a stain. Your shame is not welcome in this house." She had closed the door, the latch clicking into place like the closing of a coffin lid. No one else had offered a bed, a meal, a single cup of water. They had left her on the street in her wedding dress, a spectacle of another's sin. So she had walked. She had walked away from the town of redemption, a place that offered none. She had walked west, toward the setting sun, with no destination but away. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The thirst was a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. Her body was a machine running on its last reserves of grief and fury. She had nothing left to lose, and so she kept moving. It was the fence line that she saw first, a wavering dark line in the shimmering heat. It was new, the posts raw pine, the wire stretched taut and humming with a low, mournful song in the wind. It seemed to go on forever in either direction, a declaration of ownership in a land God himself seemed to have abandoned. Beyond it, farther in, she saw the silhouette of a small cabin and a larger barn. Smoke, thin and pale, curled from a stone chimney. Life. There was life here. She did not know how she crossed the fence. Perhaps she crawled under the wire, feeling it snag the torn silk of her bodice. Perhaps she simply fell through it. Her memory of it was a haze of desperate forward motion. She was aiming for a tree, a lone skeletal oak that stood between the fence and the cabin, its branches blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. Its meager shade was a promise of reprieve, a final destination. She reached it. She felt the rough bark against her cheek, and then the world went dark. Caleb saw her from the barn. At first, he thought she was a mirage, a trick of the heat rising from the parched earth, a smudge of white where there should only be brown and gray. He had seen strange things in the desert before, phantom lakes, armies of dust devils, skies that bled purple and orange. But this was different. This looked like a body. He set down his hammer, his hand instinctively going to the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. Trouble came in many forms in this territory, but it rarely came wearing white lace. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the brittle, sun-scorched grass. The wind was picking up, whispering of the dust storm that had been threatening for days. A low growl on the horizon. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman, curled at the base of the lightning-scarred oak. She was wearing what looked, impossibly, like a wedding gown. It was filthy and torn, and for a moment he thought she must be dead, another soul claimed by the harshness of this land. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of her back. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of caution. He had built his life here on a foundation of solitude. He did not seek company, and he certainly did not invite it. Women, in particular, were a complication he had sworn off years ago, a language he no longer spoke. They belonged to a world of attachments and emotions he had buried back east, along with his uniform and his faith. He knelt, his joints cracking in protest. Her hair was a wild tangle of dark blonde, full of dust and bits of leaf. One of her arms was thrown over her head, the skin burned red by the sun. Her feet were a mess of blood and dirt. He could see the pulse beating weakly in the tender skin of her neck. She was alive, but not by much. Leaving her here was not an option. The storm was coming, and the coyotes would be bold tonight, with a sigh that seemed to pull up from the depths of his soul. He made a decision. He holstered his pistol, bent down, and slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile collection of bones and desperation. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and a soft, unconscious sigh escaped her lips. The sound was an intrusion, a crack in the perfect, ordered silence of his world. He carried her into the cabin, the smell of dust and sun and sweat filling his small home. He laid her down gently on the coarse wool blanket of his cot, the white of her dress a stark, jarring presence against the dark, plain wood of the room. He stood over her for a long moment, a conflicted expression on his weathered face. He was a man who mended fences, tended to what little livestock he had, and read from a single, worn book by the light of a tallow candle. He did not take in strays. He went to the bucket by the door and ladled some water into a tin cup, propping her head up with one hand, careful to make as little contact as possible. He brought the cup to her lips. At first, she did not respond. Then, as a drop of water touched her cracked mouth, her lips parted. He tilted the cup slowly, letting her drink in small, careful sips. Her eyelids fluttered. Deep blue eyes, cloudy with confusion, looked up at him. She tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rasp. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her gaze darting around the spare cabin, the stone hearth, the single wooden table with its 2 chairs, the shelves holding a few tins of food and a stack of plates. It was a place of stark, masculine simplicity. Her eyes finally settled back on him. He was a tall man, built lean but strong, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His hair was dark, his face tanned and lined by the sun, and his eyes were a startlingly pale gray, watchful and unreadable. He had not shaved in several days, and the dark stubble on his jaw gave him a harsh, formidable look. "Where?" she managed to whisper. "My cabin," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, unused to conversation. "You collapsed by the fence line." She seemed to process this, her gaze dropping to her own ruined state. The tattered dress, the filthy skin. A flicker of shame crossed her face, quickly replaced by a hard glint of defiance. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, wincing as her battered feet touched the floorboards. He stepped back, giving her space, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not a man who offered comfort, and he did not know how. "You should rest," he said. It was a statement of fact, not a gentle suggestion. I am not looking for charity, she said, her voice gaining a little strength. I will not be a burden. He watched her, his gray eyes missing nothing, the trembling of her hands, the proud, rigid set of her jaw. He saw a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of her endurance and was still refusing to fall. I will not touch you, he said, the words coming out flat and final. It was a strange thing to say, but it was the most important boundary he could draw. It was a vow. You are safe here from the storm, but I will not tend to you. Hannah met his gaze, and for the first time she saw something beyond the harsh exterior. She saw a flicker of old pain in his eyes, a shadow that mirrored her own. He was not just being unkind, he was drawing a line in the sand for his own reasons. She understood lines. The world was full of them. I do not need tending, she shot back, her pride a shield. I need shelter and food. I can work for it. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend clothes and chop wood. I will earn my keep. Caleb considered her for a long, silent moment. The wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane. The sky was turning a bruised, sickly yellow. The storm was almost upon them. To turn her out now would be to condemn her. He had his own sins to account for. He did not need to add another. Her offer of work made it a transaction, an arrangement he could understand. It was clean, impersonal. All right, he said at last. You can stay until the storm passes and you have your strength back. But there are rules in this house. Hannah waited, her back straight. First, he said, his voice low and serious. No lies. I will not have lies under my roof. Whatever your story is, you keep it to yourself or you speak the truth of it, nothing in between. She nodded, her throat tight. The truth was a thing she could hardly bear to think about. Second, no noise. I have my quiet. I expect it to be kept. Another nod. Silence was a language she now knew well. He paused, his gaze shifting toward the window, which looked out on the barn. Third, and this is the most important, you are not to go near the barn. You do not enter it. You do not ask what is inside it. That place is mine. Do you understand? Hannah's eyes followed his to the barn. Through the dusty glass, she could see the heavy wooden door. Carved deep into the center of it was a cross. It was not a delicate, ornate thing. It was stark and roughly hewn, each line gouged into the wood with what looked like force, like an act of anger or desperation. It was a strange marking for a simple barn. She sensed a current of something powerful and hidden emanating from the place, a secret kept under lock and key. She sensed that the cross was not an invitation, but a warning. I understand, she said quietly. The arrangement was settled. A fragile truce was struck between two strangers, sealed by a shared desire for solitude and a respect for boundaries. The days that followed were defined by a heavy, stretching silence. The dust storm arrived, a furious, suffocating wave of grit and wind that sealed them inside the small cabin. It scoured the world outside, turning day into a dim twilight. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the scrape of Caleb's knife as he mended a piece of leather tack, and the soft whisper of Hannah's needle as she stitched the gaping tears in her wedding dress. She had washed the dress in the bucket of water he provided, the water turning a muddy brown. Now, by the firelight, she worked to repair the damage, her fingers deft and sure. It was a pointless task. She knew. The dress could never be what it was, but the simple, repetitive motion was calming. It was something to do with her hands, a way to keep her mind from splintering into 1,000 painful memories. Caleb watched her sometimes, his face impassive. He would sit at the table, cleaning his rifle or sharpening a tool, his movements economical and precise. He did not speak unless necessary. He would tell her where the flour was, or when he was going out to check on his lone horse in the stable. But he offered no conversation. He ate his meals quickly, his eyes on his plate. Yet, She felt his presence as a constant, watchful weight in the room. The land around them was a testament to a slow death. The storm had passed, but the drought remained. The riverbed that cut through the edge of his property was a dry, cracked scar on the earth. The soil was brittle, breaking into fine powder under the heel of a boot. Hunger was a constant, low hum in the background of their lives. The meals were meager: thin corn stew, hard biscuits. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the storm, a hunger for something more than just food. It was the arid silence between them, the vast, unspoken wilderness of their pasts. Hannah found her eyes drawn again and again to the barn. Each morning, when she stepped outside to fetch water from the nearly dry well, she would look at it. The cross seemed to watch her. It was a symbol of faith, but here, in this desolate place, on the door of a barn belonging to a man who lived like a hermit, it felt like something else. It felt like a monument to a wound. She sensed he was not hiding faith behind that door, but a lack of it, a loss so profound he had to carve a marker for it. The first cold night fell without warning, the desert air turning sharp and clear as glass. Caleb gave her the cot and made a bed for himself on the floor by the hearth, rolling himself in a thick horse blanket. He lay with his back to her, a silent, unmoving shape in the darkness. Hannah could not sleep. The cold seeped into her bones, a different kind of cold than the chill of grief she had grown accustomed to. She curled into a tight ball under the thin blanket, the stitched-up dress folded neatly at the foot of the cot. She closed her eyes, but all she saw was James's face, smiling at her just that morning, the morning that felt a lifetime ago. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple. She stifled a sob, burying her face in the rough pillowcase. She would not make a sound. She would keep his rule, but in the deep, quiet darkness of the cabin, a whisper escaped her lips, so soft it was barely more than a breath. "James." Across the room, Caleb lay perfectly still, his eyes wide open, staring at the embers glowing in the hearth. He had not been asleep. He rarely slept through the night. He heard her whisper, heard the name slice through the silence he had so carefully constructed. It was the sound of another world, a world of love and loss, a world he had fought so hard to leave behind. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just listened to the sound of her quiet heartbreak in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, he could not sleep at all. The day settled into a rhythm of sun and silence. Caleb rose before dawn, the first pale light finding him already at the fence line, his hammer ringing out in the cold, clear air. He moved with a relentless, punishing energy, as if he could drive back his thoughts with each strike of the hammer, each twist of the wire. He worked on the west side of his property, his back always to the road that led to town. He hauled water from the well, his reflection in the bucket a distorted, wavering stranger he refused to meet. He pulled at the withered corn stalks in his garden, his hands raw from the effort of tending to land that offered nothing in return. He was a man at war with his own small corner of the world, and with himself. Hannah's world was the four walls of the cabin. She learned its patterns, the way the morning sun cut a sharp rectangle across the floorboards, the way the wind found the cracks in the window frame and whistled a low, lonely tune. She cleaned with a ferocity that matched his, scrubbing the floors until the wood was pale, wiping the single pane of glass until it was invisible. She cooked over the fire, stretching their meager supplies with a skill born of a lean childhood. The cabin, once a place of stark, masculine neglect, began to take on a semblance of order, a quiet dignity. At night, after Caleb had settled onto his bedroll on the floor, she would take out her wedding dress. The main tiers were mended, but there were countless small frays, places where the delicate fabric had been brutalized by the wilderness. With trembling fingers, she would make tiny, meticulous stitches, her needle a small silver glint in the firelight. This was her private ritual, her time to confront the ghost of the woman she was supposed to have been. She never cried where he could hear her. Sometimes, when the ache in her chest grew too large for the small cabin, she would slip outside and walk to the edge of the dry riverbed. There, under a vast, unpitying canopy of stars, she would let the tears fall, silent tracks in the dust on her cheeks. She would cry for James, for the lie he had been, and for the hollow place he had left behind. Then she would wipe her face, her jaw set, and walk back to the cabin, her composure a fragile armor she wore for the daylight. Their silence was a language. A cup of water left on the table for her when she woke was his acknowledgement. A plate of hot food waiting for him when he came in from the fields was hers. They orbited each other like two solitary planets, held in place by a gravity of shared desolation, never touching. But the world outside their silent arrangement would not be ignored. A week after her arrival, Caleb rode his horse to town for supplies. He was gone for hours, and when he returned, a new tension rode with him. He was quieter than usual, his jaw tight, his movements stiff with a contained anger. He did not speak of it, but Hannah knew something had happened. She found out what it was 3 days later. It was a Sunday, and a longing for something familiar, something that felt like a connection to a life before ruin, took hold of her. She put on the white dress. It was still a wreck, a patched and faded relic, but it was the only other garment she owned. She brushed the dust from it, tied back her hair, and walked the 3 miles to the small wooden church in the center of the border town. She slipped into a back pew just as the sermon was beginning. The air was thick with the smell of dry wood, hymn books, and judgment. Heads turned. Whispers started. A rustle of sound that spread through the congregation like a grass fire. She felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny pinpricks on her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the preacher, a severe-looking man with a hawkish nose and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His name was Reverend Miller. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to file out, a woman with a face like a clenched fist approached her. It was the storekeeper's wife, a woman known for her rigid piety. "You have no place here," the woman said, her voice low but carrying. Hannah looked at her, confused. "This is a house of God. All are welcome." "Not all," the woman corrected, her lips a thin, unyielding line. "You are the one staying with the soldier, Caleb Stone, the bride in white. We have all heard the stories." She gestured to Hannah's dress with a contemptuous flick of her eyes. "You come in here wearing that symbol of a forsaken vow. You carry a dead man's sin on your dress. You are a cursed woman. Your presence here is an offense." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. The words struck her with a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. She looked around at the other faces. She saw no sympathy, only a cold, righteous agreement. They were casting her out, not for something she had done, but for what had been done to her. She stood, her head held high, and walked out of the church, their silent condemnation following her like a shroud. She did not realize Caleb had come to town until she saw him standing by his horse near the general store. He was arguing with Reverend Miller. The preacher's face was red, his finger jabbing toward Caleb's chest. "It is a matter of appearances. Caleb, a matter of sin. You cannot keep an unmarried woman in your home. It is an affront to this community, an affront to God. You invite scandal, and you risk your own soul." "My soul is my own affair, Reverend." Caleb's voice was a low growl. "And the woman is under my roof, which makes her my affair. Not yours, not the town's." He saw Hannah then, standing alone in the dusty street, the morning sun cruelly illuminating the shame and hurt on her face. The anger in his expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. Without another word to the preacher, he swung himself onto his horse, rode over to her, and leaned down. "Get on," he said. It was not a request. She allowed him to pull her up, to sit in front of him on the saddle. She did not look at him. She did not look at the townspeople who were now openly staring. She just held on as he spurred the horse into a gallop, leaving the town and its pious cruelties behind in a cloud of dust. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a quiet truce. It was a battlefield. Hannah could feel the unspoken questions, the simmering anger, the weight of the day's humiliation. She could not bear it after their meager supper, as Caleb stared into the fire, his face like carved stone. She finally broke the quiet. "Do you believe in God?" she asked. The question hung in the air, sharp and startling. Caleb did not move for a long moment. The only sound was the crackle of the flames. She thought he would not answer, that he would retreat further into the fortress of his silence. But then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "I used to." He rose and walked to the window, staring out at the barn, at the dark shape of the cross against the moonlit sky. "I was a chaplain, in the war." Hannah stared at his back, stunned. A chaplain, a man of God. It seemed impossible. "I joined up thinking I could make a difference," he continued, his voice rough with memory. "I thought I could offer comfort, absolution. I thought faith was a shield. But it is not. It is just words, and words do not stop a cannonball. They do not staunch a wound. They do not bring a boy's leg back." He turned to face her, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the full depth of the haunting in his eyes. It was a bottomless well of old pain. "I spent 2 years holding the hands of dying men, boys, most of them, crying for their mothers, for a God who was not listening. I prayed over them, I gave them last rites, and I watched them die, one after another. I watched them die in the mud, in the rain, their bodies torn apart. After a while, the words of the prayers turned to ash in my mouth. I lost my faith on a field in Virginia, kneeling over a boy who could not have been more than 16, and there was nothing I could do to save him. Nothing at all." He gestured toward the barn. "That is my penance, my reminder, not of God, but of my failure to be one of his good servants." The cabin was thick with the ghosts of his past. Hannah felt her own sorrow, which had felt so vast and all-consuming, make room for his. He had not just lost his faith, it had been violently ripped from him, leaving a wound that had never healed. His confession unlatched something deep inside her. The truth he had demanded on her first day was now a debt she felt compelled to pay. "The man I was supposed to marry," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "James. He was not a good man." Caleb's gaze met hers, his pale gray eyes steady and unjudging. He simply listened. "He was charming. Everyone in town thought so. But he had a sickness for gambling. I did not know how bad it was until a week before the wedding. He told me he had lost my dowry, the money my father left me. All of it. He had gambled it all away." She took a shaky breath, the memory still sharp and shameful. "I told him he had to tell my aunt, to confess what he had done. He grew angry. He said it was my fault, for not trusting him." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "He struck me, just once, across the face. It was the first time a man had ever laid a hand on me in anger." She looked up, meeting Caleb's eyes, wanting him to see the whole, ugly truth. "I was going to marry him anyway. I was ashamed. I was afraid of being left alone. I thought I could fix him. I thought love could fix him." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "The man who shot him did me a kindness. In a way, he saved me from a life of misery. But he damned me to this one." Caleb did not flinch. He did not offer platitudes or pity. He absorbed her story, the raw, painful truth of it, and held it with his own. The space between them, once an empty desert, was now filled with the landscape of their shared wounds. They were two broken people, sitting in a small, lonely cabin, and for the first time, they were not entirely alone. She did not know what compelled her. It was a simple human instinct, a need to bridge the final gap between them. She rose, walked the few steps that separated them, and reached out, her fingers gently touching the back of his hand where it rested on the table. His reaction was immediate. Electric. He flinched and pulled his hand away as if her touch had burned him, but he did not move far. His hand hovered in the air for a second before he clenched it into a fist and lowered it back to the table, a few inches from hers. The rejection was clear, but the hesitation, the fact that he did not retreat completely, was a concession. It was a start. The world outside intruded again a week later, this time with teeth. It was the middle of the night when a frantic bleating from the small pen where Caleb kept his 3 sheep shattered the silence. It was followed by a sound that made the hair on Hannah's arms stand on end. The low, guttural snarls and yips of a wolf pack. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a pistol from a holster hanging by the door. "Stay inside," he commanded, and was gone, the cabin door slamming shut behind him. Hannah stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding. She heard a shot, then another. The snarling grew more frenzied. Those sheep were their food, their future. She thought of the rifle she had seen Caleb cleaning, the one that offered more range and power than a pistol. He kept it in the barn. The rule: no trespassing into his chapel barn. She heard a pained bleat cut short, and a new sound, the triumphant howling of a kill. In that moment, the rule did not matter. Survival mattered more. Without a second thought, she unlatched the cabin door and ran barefoot into the cold night. The moon was high and bright, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. She saw Caleb, a dark figure fighting off other dark shapes at the edge of the pen. She did not hesitate. She ran straight for the barn. The heavy door was not locked. It swung inward with a low groan. The air inside was cool and smelled of old hay, dust, and something else, something earthy and sad. A shaft of moonlight from the open door cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior. She saw the rifle immediately, resting on 2 wooden pegs on the wall. She grabbed it. As she turned to leave, the moonlight caught something else. Just to the side of the entrance, in the packed earth floor, was a space that was different from the rest. It was a rectangular patch of ground, slightly raised. At its head was a simple, flat stone, half buried in the dirt. A grave. It was an unmarked grave, hidden away in this strange, cross-adorned barn. The realization settled over her, not with a shock of horror, but with a deep, quiet click of understanding. This was his secret. This was the source of the pain he carried, the reason for the cross, the penance, the solitude. She stood there for only a second, the cold weight of the rifle in her hands. She did not need to know who was buried there. She did not need to know the story. She understood, in a way that went deeper than words, that this was his sacred ground, the tomb of the man he used to be. She turned, her movements quiet and respectful, and slipped back out into the night, pulling the heavy door closed behind her. She did not ask. She would never ask. The sun had become a malevolent god, demanding tribute and offering none in return. Weeks had passed without a single cloud marring the vast, bleached blue canvas of the sky. The earth was a brittle crust, veined with cracks that seemed to go down into the very heart of a dead world. The well, their lifeline, had gone shallow. Each bucket Caleb drew up was half full of muddy, bitter-tasting water. It was enough to keep them and the horse alive, but just barely. A slow, thirsty death was creeping in from the edges of the horizon. One morning, Caleb stood at the cabin door, his jaw set in a hard line. "I am riding out," he announced, not looking at her. "There is a mining post 2 days east. They have a deep well. I can trade some of the tools my father left me for flour and clean water." Hannah said nothing, just nodded. She knew what he was leaving unsaid. Their supplies were nearly gone. The last of the salted meat had been eaten 3 days ago. They were down to a handful of cornmeal and a few withered potatoes. Thirst was a constant fire in her throat, but hunger was a hollow, grinding ache in her belly. He saddled his horse, his movements economical and grim. He filled 2 canteens with the muddy water from the well. When he was ready, he paused, his hand on the horse's neck. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes holding a flicker of something she could not name. Concern? Regret? "There is a rifle by the door," he said. "Keep it loaded. Do not open the door for anyone." "I will be fine," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He swung himself into the saddle and, without a backward glance, rode east, a solitary figure shrinking into the shimmering heat. Hannah watched until he was gone, a speck of dust swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It was heavier, emptier than when he was there. For the first time since she had arrived, she was truly alone. The first day, she kept busy. She cleaned the cabin, swept the packed earth in front of the door, and rationed a small portion of cornmeal for her supper. But her eyes kept drifting to the barn. The cross on the door seemed to beckon and repel her in equal measure. The secret of the grave was a hook in her mind, a question that demanded an answer. She had given him her truth. She felt a desperate, gnawing need to know his. On the second day, the need became unbearable. The oppressive heat and the profound loneliness wore down her resolve. She told herself it was a violation, a betrayal of the fragile trust they had built. But another voice, a stronger, more desperate one, told her that she could not live under the same roof as a ghost she did not know. Just after midday, when the sun was at its most punishing, she walked to the barn. The door groaned open, and she slipped into the cool, dusty darkness. Her eyes adjusted slowly. She saw the place where she had stood that night, the rifle on the wall, and the patch of earth that was not like the rest, the unmarked grave. She knelt beside it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had no shovel. She began to dig with her bare hands, the dry, packed earth scraping her fingers raw. She dug with a desperate urgency, as if the truth itself was a treasure that would be lost if she did not find it quickly. About a foot down, her fingers struck something hard and metallic. It was a small tin box, rusted at the edges. It was not heavy. With trembling hands, she pried open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried leaves, was a small stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink a pale brown, faded by time. She untied the ribbon. The handwriting was feminine, a delicate, looping script that slanted with an emotional urgency. She unfolded the first letter. "My dearest Caleb," it began. "3 months have passed since you left, and the silence you left behind is a torment. He is worse than ever. His moods are a storm, and I am the only shore they break upon. Last night, She had stopped there, a small, dark smudge of ink marring the page, a testament to a thought too painful to write. The letter went on, a plea for a word, a sign, anything to prove that he still thought of her. Hannah read them all. There were 5 of them. Each one was a portrait of a quiet, desperate misery. They spoke of a life lived in fear, of a husband's cruelty, of a love for Caleb that was both a sin and a salvation. The last letter was the most desperate of all. "He knows, Caleb. I do not know how, but he knows about us. He looks at me with a hatred that chills my soul. I am afraid of what he will do. Please, I beg of you, come back. Take me away from this place. I will go anywhere with you. I will be your wife, your servant, anything. Just do not leave me here to face him alone. Your Elspeth." Every letter was unanswered. He had kept them, but he had never replied. Hannah sat back on her heels, the letters in her lap, the sunlit doorway a world away. She now understood the cross, the penance, the solitude. He was not mourning a dead lover. He was mourning the woman he had abandoned. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound of a horse's hooves. Caleb was back a day early. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She put the letters back in the box, pushed it into the hole, and hastily scraped the dirt back over it. It was a clumsy, panicked job. She knew he would see it. She did not care. She walked out of the barn and into the blinding sunlight, the tin box clutched in her hand. He was dismounting, his face grim with exhaustion. He saw her standing by the barn, and his eyes immediately narrowed, first at her, then at the box in her hand. A storm gathered on his face, darker and more violent than any dust storm. "I told you not to go in there," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I had to know," she said, her own voice shaking but firm. She held out the box. "Who was she?" He looked at the box, then back at her, his face a mask of anguish and fury. For a moment, she thought he would strike her. Instead, he turned away, running a hand over his face. He walked to the water trough and stood there for a long time, his back to her. When he finally turned around, the fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. "Her name was Elspeth," he said, his voice hollow. "She was the wife of a man I worked for, back in Ohio, a man named Silas. He was a brute. He drank, and he used his fists to speak for him. Elspeth, she was like a flower growing in a rock pile, gentle, kind." He paused, gathering the words from a place of deep pain. We were never together, not in the way you are thinking, but we talked. I would listen. That was all. But it was enough. We fell in love with the idea of each other. I suppose, a way out for both of us." He looked at the barn, at the grave she had disturbed. "Silas found out about the letters. He came at me one night, in the barn. He was drunk, mad with rage. He said he was going to kill her, and then me. He had a pitchfork. I had a shovel. It was a moment of red. When it was over, he was on the ground, and I was standing over him. I had killed him." Hannah stood frozen, the tin box feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. "Elspeth came running," he continued, his eyes vacant, lost in the memory. "She saw what I had done. She fell to her knees and she begged me. She begged me to take her with me, to run away together. She said we were free." He let out a harsh, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "Free!" I looked at her, and I looked at her dead husband on the floor, and I knew I was not free. I was damned. So I buried him, right there, in the floor of the barn. And I made a vow, over that fresh dug earth. I swore to God, to myself, that I would never touch her, that I would never touch another woman. I could not build a life on the foundation of a dead man. I could not give her a love that was born from violence and sin. So I ran. I ran west, and I never looked back. He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading for a judgment she did not feel. I brought ruin to her life. I left her a widow with a murdered husband and a stained name. I will not do that to another woman. That is why I live as I do. That is my penance. Tears were streaming down Hannah's face, but they were not tears of fear or judgment. She was crying for him, for the terrible weight he had carried alone for so long. And she was crying for Elspeth, the woman who had begged for a touch that never came. She saw herself in that woman, a reflection of her own ruin, her own desperate desire to be claimed, to be chosen, to be saved. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent in the dust. She stopped just before him, looking up into his tortured face. "And what if I do not want you to keep that oath?" she whispered. The question shattered the last of his defenses. A raw, guttural sob broke from his chest. He reached out, his hands shaking, and took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. His touch was a brand, a fire on her skin. He looked at her as if he were a starving man looking at a feast, a drowning man looking at a shore. He leaned in, his mouth hovering inches from hers. She could feel his breath, could see the war in his eyes. Then he broke. He pulled his hands away as if he had been burned, stumbling back a step. "No," he choked out. I I cannot ruin you like I ruined her." Before either of them could say another word, a new smell cut through the hot, dry air. It was the smell of smoke, acrid and sharp. They both looked to the west. A plume of dark gray smoke was rising from the low hills, staining the pristine sky. Below it, a line of angry orange flickered, a brush fire, and the wind was blowing it directly toward them. There was no more time for the past. The present was coming for them, on a wall of flame. For the next 2 hours, they fought. Caleb worked with a grim, focused intensity, shouting orders. Hannah obeyed without question. They filled buckets with the last of the well water, soaking burlap sacks. They beat at the edges of the fire as it reached his property line, the heat scorching their faces, the smoke filling their lungs. Ash fell from the sky like a black snow. They were a team, moving together in a desperate, frantic dance of survival. They fought for the cabin, for the barn, for this small, barren patch of land that had become their world. In the smoke and the chaos, the barriers between them were burned away. They were no longer two strangers, but two people fighting for the same thing: life. As twilight fell, the wind shifted, and the immediate danger passed, the fire moving north of them. They were left in a world of smoke and shadow, their faces black with soot, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. They stood in the yard between the cabin and the barn, the smell of burnt earth all around them, watching the orange glow recede into the distance. In the choking, hazy air, they clung to each other, not in passion, but in a shared, desperate relief. Hannah buried her face in his chest, her body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. He held her tight, his arms a circle of strength around her. That night, they did not go into the cabin. They stood in the dirt yard, behind the barn, in the shadow of the rough-hewn cross. The world had been scoured by fire, and she felt scoured, too, burned down to the very core of who she was. All the shame, the grief, the years of being a good, proper woman, it had all turned to ash. All that was left was a raw, aching need. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and luminous in the twilight. She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the frantic, exhausted beat of his heart. "Take what is left of me," she begged, her voice a raw whisper. And with that, Caleb's vow, his penance, the fortress he had built around his heart, crumbled into dust. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not clean. It was a collision of hunger and desperation, of two pasts filled with pain and two futures that held no promises. It was the taste of smoke and tears and dust. He pushed her back against the rough wood of the barn, his hands tangled in her hair, his body pressing her into the wall. It was a desperate, real and consuming act, full of something neither of them could name. It was not love. It was something deeper, more honest. It was a claiming. Afterwards, they lay in the dirt, their bodies slick with sweat and soot, the world silent except for their ragged breathing. The moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the scorched landscape. After a long while, Caleb got to his knees. He crawled to the base of the cross he had carved, and he wept. He wept for the man he had killed, for the woman he had abandoned, for the vow he had just broken. He wept for the wasted years and for the sin he believed would damn his soul. Hannah did not leave him. She crawled to his side, her body aching, and took his hand in hers. She did not speak. She just held on, a quiet anchor in his storm, as his tears fell onto the dry, thirsty earth. A fragile peace settled over the scorched land. In the days that followed the fire, the world seemed to take a tentative breath. A thin veil of clouds, the first in months, gathered at the far edges of the sky, a half-forgotten promise in the blackened soil. Caleb pointed out a marvel, tiny green buds pushing through the ash on a wild grapevine he had thought long dead. The land, resilient and ancient, was beginning to show signs of its own stubborn recovery. But as life returned to the earth, It soured in the hearts of men. The peace that had settled between Hannah and Caleb did not extend beyond their fence line. The town of Harmony, it seemed, could not abide it. Their union, forged in fire and desperation, was a scandal that festered in the pious minds of the townsfolk. The whispers that had once followed Hannah now clung to Caleb as well. He was no longer just the reclusive soldier. He was the sinner who harbored the cursed bride. The town's silent judgment took a physical form one morning. Caleb found it when he went to check the fence post nearest the road. A rope, thick and coarse, had been tied into a hangman's noose and left dangling from the top wire. It swayed gently in the morning breeze. A grotesque and unambiguous message. A warning, a punishment. He did not take it down immediately. He stood there for a long time, his face unreadable, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked at it not with fear, but with a cold, familiar rage. It was the language of mobs and vigilantes, a language he had hoped he had left behind in the war. When he finally untied it, he coiled it with a grim precision and carried it back to the cabin. Hannah was outside, shaking a blanket. When she saw him coming, she saw the rope in his hand, saw the shape of it, and her breath caught in her throat. A cold dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone despite the morning heat. He said nothing, just walked past her and threw the noose into the fire pit, where it lay like a coiled snake. "They are trying to scare us," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "They are trying to scare you," he corrected, his voice low and hard. He turned to her, his pale eyes intense. "This is because of me, because you are with me." "I am not scared," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. The fear was a cold stone in her gut, but above it was a rising tide of defiance. She had already lost everything once. The threats of these small, cruel people seemed insignificant in comparison. A few days later, their supplies were low again. The flour he had gotten from the mining post was nearly gone. He laid a few coins on the table, the last of his money. "We need salt and flour," he said, "and coffee." He looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. He did not want her to go to town, to face their venom, but his horse had thrown a shoe, and his own presence would only invite more trouble. "And a dress," he added, his voice rough. He pushed another coin across the table. "Buy yourself a dress, a colored one." The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it left her speechless for a moment. It was his way of trying to protect her, to erase the spectral image of the bride in white. It was his way of saying that she was more than her past, that she was a living woman, not a ghost. She walked to town wearing the mended wedding dress for what she hoped would be the last time. She held her head high, her back straight, ignoring the stares and the whispers that parted before her like a foul wind. In the general store, she bought the flour, salt, and coffee first, her movements deliberate and calm. Then, she looked at the dresses. There were not many. She chose a simple one, the color of a summer sky, made of sturdy blue calico. She was counting out the coins on the counter when the storekeeper's wife, the same woman who had condemned her in the church, appeared from the back room. Her face was a mask of sour disapproval. "We do not serve your kind here," the woman said, her voice dripping with venom. "My kind?" Hannah replied, her voice steady. "You mean the kind that pays for their goods?" The woman's eyes narrowed into slits. "Everyone knows what you are, living in sin with that godless soldier. You are a whore, nothing more." The word was a physical blow. It struck the air from Hannah's lungs, and then the woman's hand followed. A swift, hard slap across Hannah's cheek that snapped her head to the side. The sting was sharp, shocking. The whole store went silent. For a heartbeat, all Hannah felt was a white-hot flash of rage. She wanted to lash out, to match the woman's ugliness with her own. But then she looked at the woman's face, at the bitter, pinched lines around her mouth, at the cold emptiness in her eyes, and she felt not hatred, but a strange, profound pity. This woman, with her clean dress and her respected place in the community, was more of a prisoner than she was. Hannah raised a hand to her stinging cheek, not in submission, but in a gesture of quiet contemplation. She turned her head and met the woman's hateful gaze directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the store with the clarity of a bell. "You will never know what it means to be chosen after ruin," she said softly. "You will never know what it is to have a man look at what is broken and ash and call it worthy. I would not trade 1,000 of your respectable days for 1 hour of that." She placed the coins for the dress on the counter, gathered her purchases, and walked out of the store, leaving the woman standing there, speechless, her hand still raised in the air. When she returned to the cabin, the red mark of the slap was still visible on her cheek. Caleb saw it the moment she walked in. He stopped what he was doing, a piece of leather half mended in his hands. A dangerous stillness came over him. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice deceptively quiet. "It does not matter." "Who did this to you, Hannah?" he insisted, taking a step toward her. The quiet was gone, replaced by a low, simmering fury. "The storekeeper's wife," she admitted. "She called me a name." He looked at the angry red mark, then at her eyes, and all the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a deep, weary pain. It was the look of a man who believed he was a curse, who believed he brought destruction to everything he touched. "You have to leave," he said, his voice flat and raw. "This is not going to stop. They will not stop until they have driven you out, or worse. It is not safe for you here. I can give you the horse. You can ride west to California. You can start over." He was pushing her away to save her. He was trying to do for her what he had not done for Elspeth. He was trying to let her go before the ruin was complete. But she was not Elspeth, and she would not run. She stepped toward him, her eyes blazing. "And what would I be starting over with? Another life of being alone, of being looked through and cast aside. I was rotting alone before I came here. I would rather burn with you than go back to that." His face crumpled, the harsh lines softening with a pain that mirrored her own. Her words had reached him, had broken through the wall of his guilt. This was her choice, her vow. The town did not relent. A few days later, Reverend Miller rode out to the ranch, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. He found Caleb by the corral. "I have warned you, Caleb," the preacher began, without preamble. "The town will not tolerate this. You have brought a fallen woman into your home, and you live with her in defiance of God's law. You are a cancer in this community." "Last I checked, this is my land," Caleb said, his voice level. "And my sin to answer for, not yours." "You have a choice," the preacher snarled, his voice rising. "Marry the woman and give her the protection of your name, or send her away. You cannot have both salvation and sin. You must choose." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the dry. Still air. The preacher's visit, the constant threat from the town, the noose hanging in his memory. It all began to wear on Caleb. The tightly controlled peace he had built in his solitude was shattered. The ghosts he had kept at bay for so long came flooding back. The nightmares returned. He would thrash in his sleep, his hands clenched, a low moan escaping his lips. He was back in the war, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. He saw the faces of the boys he had failed to save, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. He was back in that other barn, the shovel heavy in his hands, the face of Silas a mask of rage and surprise. The first night it happened, Hannah was terrified. She woke to the sound of his ragged breathing and found him caught in the throes of a violent dream. But she did not run. She went to him, knelt on the floor beside his bedroll, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Caleb," she whispered. "Caleb, you are here. You are safe." She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, her hand a steady, warm presence on his back. She did not try to wake him. She just stayed with him, a quiet anchor in the storm of his memories, until the thrashing subsided and his breathing evened out. She held him through the fire and the blood, and when the dawn came, she was still there. The climax arrived on a hot, breathless afternoon. Hannah was inside, kneading dough for bread, when she heard the sound of multiple horses. She looked out the window and saw them, a group of 5 men riding slowly toward the cabin. They all had rifles resting across their saddles. They were not the law. This was something else. Caleb came out of the barn, a hammer in his hand, and stood in the yard, watching them approach. He was calm, his body still, but Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand was positioned near the pistol at his hip. The men reined in their horses a few yards from where he stood. One of them, a man with a hard, bitter face and eyes full of a familiar hatred, dismounted. "I am Thomas Brody," the man said, his voice flat and cold. "Silas Brody was my brother." The name hung in the air, a death knell from the past. So, the story had followed him, or perhaps his sin had finally caught up. "Heard you were living out here," Thomas Brody continued, his eyes flicking from Caleb to the cabin, where he must have known Hannah was watching. "Heard you were living with a whore, shacked up in your own filth. We have come for justice, the kind the law is too slow to deliver." Hannah's blood ran cold. She saw Caleb's hand drop to the handle of his pistol. Before he could draw it, before a single shot could be fired, she was out the door. She did not remember running, but suddenly she was there, in the dirt between Caleb and the 5 rifles, her bare feet planted in the sun-baked earth. She faced the men, her chin high, her eyes burning with a fury that left no room for fear. "If you want him, you have to come through me," she said, her voice clear and strong. Thomas Brody sneered. "Get out of the way, girl. This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she said. She looked at their faces, at their righteous anger, and she laughed, a sound that was both broken and fearless. "Go on. Then, shoot. I am already dead. The woman I was is buried and gone. You have nothing to threaten me with." One of the other men raised his rifle. Thomas Brody put a hand on the barrel, lowering it. He drew his own pistol. A slow, deliberate movement. He did not point it at her heart. He pointed it at the ground. "Maybe this will make you move," he said, and fired. The shot was deafening. The bullet kicked up a cloud of dust just inches from her bare foot. She did not even flinch. But Caleb did. The sound of that shot, the sight of the dust cloud by her foot, the thought of her being harmed, it broke something inside him. The years of control, of penance, of holding his soldier's instincts in check, all of it snapped. In a single, fluid motion, he drew his Colt Peacemaker. He did not aim to kill. His shot was precise, a soldier's shot. He fired once, hitting Thomas Brody in the shoulder. The man cried out in pain and surprise, dropping his pistol and staggering back. The other men, shocked into action, raised their rifles, but Caleb was already moving, pulling Hannah behind him, using his own body as a shield. "Get off my land," he roared, his voice the voice of a commander on a battlefield. "Get off my land before I kill every last one of you." There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. The men saw it in his eyes. They saw the soldier he had been, the killer he had become in that other barn. They hesitated, then slowly backed away, helping the wounded Thomas onto his horse. They rode off, their threats and curses swallowed by the vast, empty land. Hannah and Caleb stood alone in the yard, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The immediate threat was gone, but they both knew it was not over. They had just declared war. The next day, the sheriff came. He was a weary-looking man with a tin star and a tired face. He was not alone. 2 deputies were with him. Caleb was waiting for them on the porch. He did not resist. He handed over his pistol and put his hands out to be cuffed. His fight was over. The running was over. He had made his stand, and now he would face the consequences. As the sheriff led him away, Caleb looked back at Hannah. His face was grim, but his eyes held a message for her, a silent apology, a quiet plea. She stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, and watched as they took him away, the dust from their horses rising to meet the empty, waiting sky. The day they took Caleb, the sky broke. For the first time in a season of dust and prayerless heat, it began to rain. It did not come gently. It came in a torrent, a gray, sheeting deluge that hammered the tin roof of the jail and turned the dusty streets of Harmony into a thick, running slurry of mud. The parched earth, cracked and open like a beggar's palm, drank it in with a great, thirsty sigh. Out at the ranch, the scorched grapevines would be swelling, the shallow well would be filling, the land itself would be receiving a baptism, a washing away of the ash and the drought. But Caleb was in a cage. He sat on a narrow cot in a small, damp cell that smelled of rust and despair, and listened to the rain. He did not pace. He did not curse his fate. A profound, almost peaceful stillness had settled over him. The act of firing that gun, of finally choosing to stand and fight rather than run, had broken a fever that had burned in him for years. The running was over. Whatever came next, he would meet it head on. There was a strange liberation in that. On the second day of his imprisonment, the rain had softened to a steady, weeping drizzle. He had a visitor. Reverend Miller stood on the other side of the bars, his black coat damp, his face a grim mask of pastoral duty. "The Lord is merciful. Caleb," the preacher began, his voice echoing in the small, stone room. "Even to a man such as you, there is still time to repent, to confess your sins and beg for his forgiveness before you face your final judgment." Caleb looked at the preacher, his pale gray eyes clear and steady. He saw no mercy in the man's face, only a hungry sort of piety, a desire to witness a sinner's prostration. "I have made my peace with what I have done." "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice quiet. "Peace?" the preacher scoffed, his face reddening. "You call this peace? You have lived in sin. You have taken a man's life. You have brought scandal and violence to this community. God does not grant peace to the unrepentant." "Perhaps," Caleb said. He stood and walked to the bars, his movements slow and deliberate. He was not a man begging for his soul. He was a man with one final, earthly request. "There is only one thing I need from you." The preacher looked at him, expectant, perhaps hoping for the confession he so craved. "I want you to tell the sheriff to let me see her." Caleb said, "Let me see Hannah, before they hang me." The request, so simple and so human, seemed to deflate the preacher's righteous anger. He stared at Caleb, at this man who was not concerned with heaven or hell, but only with the woman he was leaving behind. The preacher said nothing, just turned and left, his boots making wet, slapping sounds on the stone floor. Hannah, meanwhile, was fighting her own war. She had walked to town in the pouring rain, the new blue calico dress soaked through and clinging to her skin. She went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, no relation to the preacher, though he carried his own brand of weary authority, looked up from his desk as she dripped onto his floor. "Sheriff, you have to let him go," she began, her voice tight with a desperation she could not conceal. "It was self-defense. Those men came to his land with rifles. They shot at me." The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Ma'am, I have a man with a bullet in his shoulder who says otherwise. I have 4 other witnesses. What I have is a man who shot first in front of half a dozen people. My hands are tied." "He was protecting me," she insisted, her voice breaking. "He was protecting his home. And now he will have to tell that to the circuit judge," the sheriff said, his tone final. Desperation clawed at her. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out the one thing of value she had left from her old life, the thin gold wedding band James had given her. It felt like a lifetime ago. She held it out on the palm of her hand. "Please," she whispered, "take this. It is all I have. Let him go. We will leave. We will ride west and never come back. No one will ever have to know." The sheriff looked at the ring, then at her tear-streaked, pleading face. He shook his head, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "I cannot be bought, ma'am. The law is the law." Hannah's composure shattered. The last of her pride fell away, leaving only a raw, primal need to save the man she could not yet put a name to what she felt. But she knew she could not live without him. "Then what do you want?" she cried, her voice raw. "Anything. I will do anything you ask. I will give you myself. Just let him go." The offer, so stark and so tragic, hung in the air between them. The sheriff's face hardened, the pity replaced by a grim sort of shame, as if her desperation were an affront to his office. "You get out of here, ma'am," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You get out of here right now before I throw you in a cell for trying to bribe an officer of the law. Go home." She left, the word home, a bitter irony. She had no home but the one he had given her. She walked back through the muddy streets, the rain mingling with her tears, her mind a frantic storm of impossible plans. That night, she acted. She did not know where the idea came from, only that she could not sit and wait for them to hang him. She remembered seeing the town blacksmith leave a key on a hook just inside his workshop door. She remembered seeing a stack of new metal files on his workbench, under the cover of the relentless rain and the deep, moonless dark. She crept through the town, her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She slipped into the smithy, her fingers finding the heavy iron key and a long, slender file. The jail was a small, squat building at the end of the main street. A single lantern burned in the sheriff's office, but the rest was dark. She crept to the side of the building, to the small, barred window of Caleb's cell. She could see his silhouette inside, sitting on the cot. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. He was at the window in an instant. "Hannah, what are you doing here? You should not be here." "I am getting you out," she said, her voice a fierce, determined hiss. She showed him the key and the file through the bars. "I have a key for the main door. I think it is the blacksmith's master key for the town's locks. If it does not work, I can file through this bar." He reached through the bars and covered her hand with his touch warm and firm despite the cold iron between them. "Hannah, no." "Yes," she insisted. "I have your horse saddled and waiting in the livery. We can be gone before sunrise. They will never find us." "No more running," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "Not from this. I have spent years running from what I did. I will not spend the rest of my life running from what I have become." "I will face them." She stared at him, at the quiet certainty in his eyes. He was not afraid. He was free, and he was choosing this. He was choosing to face the gallows with his honor intact rather than live as a fugitive. The fight went out of her, replaced by a wave of love so fierce and so painful it was like a physical blow. "Then I will not leave you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I will not." He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles through the bars. She leaned in, pressing her face against the cold, wet iron, and he met her there. Their kiss was clumsy and desperate, a joining of mouths separated by the very law that was trying to tear them apart. It was a promise. "Then let me stay with you," she whispered against his lips. The day of the trial, the rain had finally stopped. A weak, watery sun tried to break through the clouds. The small courtroom was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and nervous anticipation. The entire town of Harmony had turned out to see justice done. Caleb stood before the circuit judge, a grim-faced man with a reputation for harsh sentences. His hands were bound in front of him. He looked pale, but his posture was straight, his gaze fixed. Thomas Brody sat in the front row, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of vengeful satisfaction. The testimony was swift and damning. Thomas Brody and his men recounted their version of the events, painting Caleb as a violent, unprovoked aggressor. They spoke of his living in sin, of his godless nature, as if that were evidence enough of his guilt. The townspeople murmured their agreement. The verdict seemed a foregone conclusion. "Does the defense have any witnesses?" the judge asked, his voice bored. Caleb's court-appointed lawyer, a young, nervous man, shook his head. But before he could speak, Hannah stood up from the back of the courtroom. "I am a witness," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. All eyes turned to her. The judge looked down, his expression annoyed. "And who are you, ma'am?" "My name is Hannah," she said, walking forward until she stood at the front of the courtroom. "I am the woman he was protecting." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. The judge sighed, but gestured to the witness stand. "Very well. State your testimony." Hannah did not look at the lawyer, or the jury of grim-faced ranchers. She looked at the faces of the townspeople. She saw the storekeeper's wife, the members of the church congregation, all the people who had judged and condemned her, and she spoke to them. "You all know who I am," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I am the woman who came to your town in a ruined wedding dress. A cursed woman. Some of you called me. My name was ruined. My heart was broken, and my own kin turned me away. I came to this county with nothing but the clothes on my back and a sorrow so deep I thought it would drown me." She paused, letting her words settle. "I collapsed on this man's land, and he took me in. He, a stranger, did what no one else would. He gave me shelter from the storm. He laid down rules. He told me he would not touch me, and he kept his word. He asked for nothing from me. He let me stay, and he let me be." She turned her gaze to the judge. "The men who came to his ranch that day, they did not come for justice. They came for vengeance. They came with rifles, and they threatened an unarmed woman. They fired a gun at my feet. Caleb Stone did not fire first. He fired to protect me from men who would have done me harm. He did what any decent man would do." Then she turned back to the crowd, her eyes finding the preacher. "You speak of God's law. You speak of sin and salvation. I have seen your Christian charity. It is a cold and cruel thing. This man, this sinner, this soldier you are so quick to condemn. He did not try to save my soul. He simply saved my life." A profound silence filled the courtroom. In that silence, something shifted. The hard faces of the ranchers softened. The women who had whispered about her now looked down at their hands, their faces filled with a shame that was plain to see. The storekeeper's wife began to weep quietly into a handkerchief. Hannah's testimony had not been about the facts of the shooting. It had been about the truth of a man's character, and it had struck a chord of decency that the town had forgotten it possessed. The judge looked at the faces in his courtroom. He looked at Hannah, standing proud and defiant. He looked at Caleb, who had not taken his eyes off her the entire time. The judge cleared his throat. "Caleb Stone," he said, his voice now carrying a different weight. "The testimony against you is considerable. You took the law into your own hands. However," he paused, looking out at the crowd, "in light of the circumstances and the testimony of this witness, this court is inclined toward a measure of leniency. I will not see you hang." A collective gasp went through the room. "But you cannot stay here," the judge continued, his voice firm. "Your presence and the history that brought you here is a disruption to the peace of this community. Therefore, I sentence you to banishment. You are to be expelled from this county, effective immediately. If you are ever seen within its borders again, you will be arrested and hanged without a further trial. Do you understand?" "I understand," Caleb said, his voice clear. The trial was over. The deputies unbound Caleb's hands. As he was led from the courtroom, a free man, the sheriff stood by the door. As Caleb passed, the sheriff turned and spat on the floor at his feet, a final gesture of contempt. Caleb did not even look at him. He only looked for Hannah. She was there, waiting for him at the courthouse doors. She did not say a word. As he stepped out into the clean, rain-washed air, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, her hand a warm, solid presence in his. She was barefoot again, the fine blue dress already stained with the mud of the street. She had chosen her path. Together, they walked down the main street of Harmony, away from the jail, away from the church, away from the judgment in the eyes of the people they passed. They did not look back. They just walked, hand in hand, down the muddy road that led west, into a future as uncertain and as promising as the breaking clouds above. They walked west for 11 days. They followed the sun, leaving the county of Harmony and its judgments far behind them. They spoke little. There was nothing that needed to be said. Their companionship was a settled thing, a quiet fact written in the way he helped her over a rocky patch of ground, the way she handed him a canteen of water without being asked. They were two parts of a whole, moving as one. They found their place on the edge of a wide, clear river, miles from any town or road. It was a small, sheltered valley, with a stand of cottonwood trees for shade and a patch of fertile, dark earth that promised life. Here, the running ended. Caleb began to build their home the day they arrived. He worked with a quiet, tireless determination that Hannah had only seen before in his fight against the brush fire. He used the river stones to build the foundation and the hearth. His hands, which had once held dying soldiers and killed a man in anger, now fitting each stone into place with a patient, careful precision. He felled cottonwood trees, his axe blows ringing out in the clean, empty air. He hewed the logs with an adze, stripping them of their bark, shaping them to fit. He was not just building a shelter. He was building a sanctuary. He was building the first true home either of them had ever known. Hannah worked alongside him. She gathered reeds from the riverbank to help chink the logs. She found a patch of clay and fashioned a set of rough, simple bowls and cups, which she hardened by the fire. And every evening, she would take her wedding dress down to the river, the white dress. It was no longer the color of pure snow, but of bone and river stones and the pale dust of the trail. The hem was a tattered fringe, the delicate lace a web of memories. She would wash the day's grime from it in the cool, flowing water, her movements a gentle, repetitive ritual. Then she would spread it on a flat, sun-warmed rock to dry. She wore it every day. It was no longer a symbol of shame, a shroud for a life that had never begun. It was her history. It was the dress she had walked through the desert in, the dress she had stitched by firelight, the dress she had worn when he had first claimed what was left of her. It was a testament to her survival, tattered and worn and beautiful. She wore it with a quiet, unyielding pride. The cabin took a month to build. It was a single, sturdy room, with a wide hearth that drew well and a window that looked out over the river. It was spare and simple, but it was theirs. The day it was finished, Caleb built a table and 2 chairs from the leftover wood. That night, they ate their meal of roasted fish at the table, the firelight casting warm, dancing shadows on the log walls. A silence settled between them, but it was not the arid, watchful silence of the old cabin. It was a silence of deep, shared contentment. A silence that did not need to be filled. They planted crops, in the dark, rich soil by the river. They sowed the seeds of corn and beans and squash that Caleb had traded for his last good knife at a remote trading post. They worked the earth together, side by side. He would break the ground with a shovel, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy rhythm. She would follow behind, dropping the seeds into the furrows, her bare feet pressing them into the soil. Their days were measured by the sun and the needs of the land. They spoke little, but their communication was a seamless flow of shared purpose. A nod, a gesture, a shared look was all that was needed. When they did speak, their words were like the land itself, honest and rough and kind. One hot afternoon, nearly a year after they had arrived, Hannah was weeding the garden when she saw something moving at the edge of the woods. It was small. At first, she thought it was a deer or a coyote. She stood slowly, shading her eyes. It was a child, a boy, no older than 7 or 8, with a tangle of pale hair and clothes that were little more than rags. He was walking unsteadily, as if he had been walking for a very long time. She called out to Caleb. He came from the cabin, a piece of fishing net he was mending still in his hands. He saw the boy and stopped, a watchful stillness coming over him. The boy saw them, too. He stopped walking and stood there, wavering on his feet, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Hannah walked toward him slowly, her hands held out, palms open. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft. "We will not hurt you." The boy did not run. He just stood there, his small body trembling. When she reached him, she knelt in the dirt in her white dress. He had the gaunt, haunted look of a child who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He was an orphan. She knew it instantly. A piece of human driftwood, washed up on their shore. She and Caleb took him in without question. They did not ask him where he came from, or what had happened to his family. The story was in his eyes, in his silence. They gave him a bowl of stew, which he ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger. They washed the dirt from his face and hands in a basin of warm water. That night, he slept on a soft bed of blankets Hannah made for him by the fire, the deepest, most exhausted sleep of the truly lost who have finally been found. They did not have much, but what they had, they shared. The quiet space of their life for 2 simply expanded to make room for 3. A few days after the boy arrived, Hannah saw Caleb walking toward the stand of oak trees by the river, his axe in his hand. He spent the entire day there. She could hear the steady, rhythmic chop of the axe, a sound that had become as familiar to her as the flow of the river. Late in the afternoon, he came back, carrying a heavy, roughly hewn cross over his shoulder. It was made of solid oak, the wood pale and strong. It was not like the other cross, the one he had gouged into the barn door out of anger and despair. This one was different. The lines were clean, the shape of it perfect and sure. He did not take it to the back of the cabin. He walked to the center of their small garden, the place of life and new growth, and with his bare hands, he dug a hole and planted it firmly in the earth. It stood tall against the afternoon sun, its shadow stretching long over the rows of corn and beans. This cross was not a monument to a grave. It was not a symbol of penance. It was a promise. It was an anchor, a declaration that this place, this life, this family was sacred. The summer deepened. The days were long and hot, the evenings filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle murmur of the river. On one such evening, the air was thick and still, the sky a bruised purple and orange as the sun sank below the horizon. The boy was asleep inside the cabin. Hannah was leaning against the base of the oak cross, the rough wood solid against her back. She watched Caleb as he chopped the last of the firewood for the night, his body moving with a fluid, powerful grace. The sound of the axe, the sight of him against the fading light, it all felt so right, so deeply and irrevocably hers. She waited until he had set the last piece of wood on the pile. Then she called his name, her voice soft in the twilight. He turned, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He saw her by the cross, her white dress almost glowing in the dim light, and he walked toward her. He did not stop until he was standing right in front of her. He looked down at her, his pale eyes full of a quiet, steady light she had come to know as love. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. She looked into his eyes, and she gave him the final piece of her truth, the one she had only just come to understand herself. "There is nothing left of who I was," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was not sorrow. "The girl who wanted a fine wedding, the woman who was afraid of being alone, the bride who grieved for a lie, she is gone. All of her is gone, and I am not sorry." A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, a rare and beautiful thing. He covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm warm and strong over hers. He looked at her, this fierce, resilient woman who had walked out of the ashes of her own life and taught him how to live in the ruins of his. "Then I will take all that remains," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly vow. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that held no desperation, no hunger, no ghosts of the past. It was a kiss of profound and simple peace. It was the kiss of a man who was finally home. The camera of the mind would pull back then. A wide, sweeping shot of the scene, the deep orange of the sunset bleeding into the river, the dark, solid shape of the cross, a testament not to a distant God, but to the holy thing two ruined people had built with their own hands, the endless, dusty land stretching out around them. And in the center of it all, two figures, small against the vastness of the world, holding on to all that remained. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.